Good morning to everybody, and thank you for attending the OALA's Continuing Education Seminar that's been organized by our Continuing Education Committee. The chair of the Continuing Education Committee, Jim Hosick, is here, and he will introduce our speaker, Jane Welsh, in a few minutes. Before I turn over the presentation to Jim, I wanted to note just a few housekeeping items. You'll note that all the attendees are muted for this webinar, and we will keep you muted. And then if you have questions, please type them in the questions box that's on the side, should be on the side of your screen. And Jane will run through her presentation, and then at the end, there will be time for questions. I'll read the questions out for Jane to respond. If there isn't time to get to them all, they are all recorded for us, so we'll work them to follow up by email for any unanswered questions. We will be recording the webinar, and we'll post a link in the members area on the OALA website. And also a link to this recording will be emailed to all attendees at today's presentation. You'll get it about an hour after the presentation. And with that, we'll send a short survey. It should take less than 2 minutes to complete, but it has a spot to note any other areas of interest for you for webinars. So if you have time, please do fill out that quick survey. The slides are not being emailed out, but if you'd require a copy of the slides, please contact either Janine or me at the office, so either coordinator@oala.ca or registrar@oala.ca, and we'll email you a copy of the presentation. OALA members who are attending today may submit 1 credit for attending the webinar, or once you've finished watching the recording, if you use both. So with that, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Jim now. Thanks.
So welcome everyone. I'm Jim Hosick. We'd like to thank Jane Welsh for leading our webinar today, entitled How We Can Ensure that Toronto's Growth is Climate Resilient, and what is the role of landscape architecture in making that happen. Most OALA members know Jane as the president of the OALA. I would like to provide just a few more details of Jane's work in the profession. Jane's a project manager, environmental policy at Toronto City Planning, and over 30 years municipal planning experience. Her work at the City of Toronto includes development and implementation of new innovative initiatives such as the Toronto Green Standard, Green Roof Bylaw, Residential Apartment Commercial Zone, and the development of land use policy tools for natural heritage protection, biodiversity, climate change, energy, and sustainable development. Jane's also responsible for the preparation of environmental policies for the official plans for Toronto and Metro Toronto. Jane has served on the OALA Council since 2014 and took the role of president in 2018. She currently serves on 8 OALA committees and volunteers for the CSLA, where she leads their committee on climate adaptation. For her work in support of the profession, Jane was inducted into the CSLA College of Fellows in 2018. We know that Jane's work for the city and her volunteer roles fill her time quite a bit. So we're really grateful that she has carved out some time for us on the topic of climate resiliency and the role of landscape architecture in making it happen. Thanks, Jane. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Jim. Hello, everybody. I'm so pleased to share this presentation with you. I gave this presentation at the OPPI conference with the Resilience lead at the city, Amy Butensis, about a year ago. And it's really a reflection of the work that I do. It's also a reflection of my foundation in education and landscape architecture and how I use that in my job of developing environmental policy in Toronto City Planning. The interim resilience assessment done by Amy's team had contained a very provocative question: how can we ensure Toronto's growth is climate resilient? I thought we needed to take that on and think comprehensively about how and what tools we had and how we could ensure that new growth would be climate resilient. We started by having a workshop with planning staff across every division and level in city planning, from assistant planner to director level, and that included at least 4 landscape architects. This presentation will identify some of the thinking around our existing tools and around emerging directions, and also some thoughts about landscape architects' role in ensuring growth is resilient. Next, please. So, as you know, most of you know, our understanding of resilience is that it's the ability to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of any challenge. Next. Toronto had launched its resilience strategy in June of 2019. The strategy focused on climate change and inequity. It outlined why resilience is important and what we need to be thinking about in Toronto. It was held at the University of Toronto in the Daniel School of Architecture, Landscape and Design. I was there. I'm kind of hidden behind the 9 in that slide, as well as a number of senior officials from the City of Toronto. Next. What was interesting is that it also involved a wonderful display that was put on by the school, and that was curated by Fadi Massoud, who is assistant professor of landscape architecture and urbanism at the school. Anchoring the exhibit were 2 large models that represent 2 of the fundamental pillars of the strategy, equity and urban flooding. One model shows Toronto's topography, and you can really see that clearly in the middle slide. It's the hills, the ravines, and river systems. And this, what they did was they exaggerated it by 15 times, so you could really see the differences. And the second one is about the increasing inequity in Toronto, based on the research by U of T professor David Helsinski. And to address these issues, Fadi noted that there is a huge potential to design networks of green space, both public and private, to serve multiple functions and to act as water retention systems throughout the city. Next slide. We talk a lot about climate change, and we know that our climate in Toronto is going to look different. And this is modeling Toronto here. It's going to look a lot different in 20 years. It's going to be hotter, wetter, and wilder. And that means that we're going to have more heat waves. We get about 3 each year now. We're going to have 3 times as much as that. And we're going to get more rainfall at one time, so more intense rainfall events. So we have to plan for that. Next. And knowing that we have a lot about, and next again, Julian, so we have a lot of data about future climate, but we're now starting to see public understanding of what that means. Youth are really engaged in thinking about climate change and pushing leaders to do more to stop it. And we have climate change as a key political issue. There's a lot of groundswell of understanding and awareness from the public that governments need to act, both to stop climate change and to adapt to the change we know is coming, even if we are able to take some significant action to stop it. Next. And for the next slide, I wanted to take just a minute about the inequity issue. The importance of this has emerged strongly as we deal with the pandemic. These maps benchmark the average individual incomes to the city's average, comparing 1996 to 2016. And this particular slide shows 1996. And the polarization of income is clearly evident in both years. And green indicates higher than average and pink lower than average. Next, please. If we consider the white areas as middle income, that being 20% below or above the average, we see the erosion of the middle income in the last 20 years. You can see this in this slide. Also, in the 2016 map, the 2 darkest green colors are new. They represent census tract with income between 4 to 8 times the average, and those categories did not exist in 1996. The data points to not only a polarization of income spatially, but towards a polarization that is deeper than before. Next slide. And it's something that we as landscape architects and city builders need to be mindful of. So When we gave this presentation last year, we asked everyone to pause for a moment and think about the moment in their community's history that contributed to its existence. So we talked about two of Toronto's resilient stories. One was the bathhouse raids, when police raided 4 city bathhouses and arrested more than 250 men. And what happened was there was such a significant community response that resulted in the first Pride Parade and a city inquiry about the actions of the police. And then, of course, there was Hurricane Hazel, which on October 15th, almost whatever that is, 66 years ago, I guess, 1954, caused 81 deaths and over $1 billion in damage. In the aftermath, the region fundamentally changed how it planned for flooding, including expropriating flooded lands where people lived and to use them as park areas. And of course, now we're in the middle of a global story about our individual and collective resilience to the pandemic. Next slide. And of course, the backdrop to all these challenges is the rapid growth in our city. And as we make investments to deal with the growth, we need to make sure every investment is going to serve us well in a future climate, and every investment is reducing inequity and not making it worse. This map shows the estimated future population of all residential units in the pipeline, which means those that are planned, and some are approved, some are just been submitted. That would effectively add another 400,000 people to the city's population, bringing us to about 3.4 million by 2041. We're well on track to meet our provincial targets. For an example, in 2018, the city approved 20,000 residential units, and so far this year, as of September, we've approved 15,610 new units. So we continue to grow. Next slide. And that just shows it build out, sorry. Next slide again. So part of the question we had to ask ourselves is, what is climate resilient growth? How are we achieving climate resilience? What are the opportunities, the gaps, and where can we advance the agenda and do more? What role can planning, what role can landscape architecture take in making us more resilient to climate? I define climate resilient growth as about the ability to survive, adapt, and thrive, about reducing shocks and stresses, about protecting natural heritage, achieving robust and healthy biodiversity, about design that is sensitive to water, that helps to manage stormwater, about designing floodable open spaces, about new development in neighborhoods that are low carbon, about reducing the urban heat island, and about preparing for extreme weather. Next slide. In my world, I have to think about the tools that we have, both regulatory and others, and how they can shift thinking and change how we design and build. We've been pushing the envelope in our work in Toronto, developing new innovative tools over the last 15 years to deal with climate change, mostly in two main ways. In terms of the official plan updates, in terms of new and emerging secondary plan policies, in our ravine and green roof bylaws, in our various strategies, and also in the investments we make, investments we give to the private sector, investments the city makes itself in capital infrastructure, and investing in communication tools, and also in building capacity amongst staff and amongst the public. Next slide. So building in Toronto means we have to make sustainable choices about how we grow. We have to see connections, understand consequences of choices. We have to integrate environmental, social, and economic perspectives into our decision making. And of course, meet the needs of today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. The official plan is one of our main tools. It's a statutory document that guides land use in the city. It envisions Toronto as a city with a connected system of natural features and ecological functions that support biodiversity and contribute to city life. Next slide. And fundamental to resilience is protection of our natural heritage area. This map illustrates our natural system and the various tools we use to protect it. If you can see it, I guess the green underlay is the natural heritage system, and that's defined in the official plan. The orange is the environmentally significant areas. There's about 86 in Toronto. The gold overlay is the Ravine and Natural Features Protection Bylaw. And that means that a permit is required for removing a tree of any size and or any changes to grade. And that again is overlaid with the Conservation Authority fill regulation line. And that works together to protect both vegetation and landform. Next slide. We've been addressing resilience in our recent planning studies and secondary plans, for example, TO Core, or the downtown plan for the City of Toronto, in which we've set out policies that address development and streetscape that require them to integrate stormwater capture, trees, and other plantings, to have development that would provide backup power beyond what the building code requires, to have development encouraging them to contribute to biodiversity by thinking about habitat, varieties of species, biodiverse green roofs, and also encouraging development to incorporate recovery of low carbon energy where possible from existing infrastructure such as sewers and transit power stations, and also to target near zero emissions. Next slide. So part of the downtown plan, and this part actually won an award, and it was done by Public Work. Next slide. Is really thinking about the core circle of the parks and how those parks, next click again, so the image will come up, how the core circle connects to all the parks in the city, next again, and also to the streets. And there we go. And then connecting that again to the shoreline. Probably next again, so there it goes. So that kind of gave you this amazing connection, and very important to consider how all that works together. We also require higher performance for new development through the Toronto Green Standard, and we require that the Toronto Green Standard checklist it has to be submitted as part of a complete application, so if you don't submit it, it's not complete and the clock doesn't start ticking. It has 63 performance measures. And so this slide gives you a snapshot of some of the elements that we require in Tier 1, such as requiring 50% of rainfall be retained on the site, which requires often a lot of creativity in designing for retention and infiltration and reuse. We require submission of an energy model indicating absolute performance targets can be met, including a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And essentially, this target is about 15% better than the current Ontario Building Code. We also look at support for pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, requiring accessible bicycle spaces, requiring cool and permeable paving materials, requiring green infrastructure such as green roofs to assist in stormwater retention, and also reducing runoff, and also tree planting and make sure there's enough soil to grow healthy trees. Also, we think about glazing treatments that reduce bird collisions, and also any development that is in or near the natural heritage will be required to provide 100% native species. And also a stewardship plan has to be submitted. And since 2010, over 2,000 developments have been required to meet Tier 1. And that has resulted in an annual greenhouse gas emission reduction of about 182,000 tons of CO2, or carbon equivalent, compared to projects built to the Ontario Building Code. Next slide. Another key regulatory tool is the Green Roof Bylaw. And since 2010, when this came into effect, there's been over 700 green roofs constructed. And that's resulted in over 500,000 square meters of green roof area in the city. And this particular green roof was actually designed by Janet Rosenberg. And I can't remember the name of the building, but it's just off King Street. When I was in my office, it was actually, I could see it from my office window. Next slide. So also, surprisingly, is the zoning bylaw has a role to play as a regulatory tool. And so what we do for a low rise is we require 75% of the landscaping has to be soft landscaping for a front yard, and 50% of any landscaping has to be soft landscaping for rear yards. And that changes a bit depending on the frontage of the lot. zoning bylaw tends to be very dense rules, but you can still get some green things happening there. It also says that buildings have to be set back 10 meters from a stable top of bank or a ravine area. Next slide. So other tools for resilience include strategies. And, you know, Toronto is incredibly blessed to have this fabulous ravine system. And it's really key to our resilience, obviously, for river flooding, that they tend to be contained. Because of Hurricane Hazel, we have incredibly strong regulatory tools prohibiting development anywhere in the floodplain, unless preventative measures are addressed. But it means that we have to keep that system healthy. So the ravine strategy was really the first time that anybody had thought comprehensively about the ravine as a system and ensuring that it retained its health and had a healthy biodiversity and had, most importantly, investment made in it. Investment made in terms of removing invasive species, investment made in terms of restoration, investment made in terms of securing better access. And so as part of the ravine strategy itself won a CSLA National Award in 2019, but as part of the work to underline the implementation plan, which came out earlier this year, it was work done by Shoreline and Company. And what they did was look at all the ravine system and then identify priority areas based on a set number of criteria. The first priority being protection of the natural system. So that allowed us to go forward and then to ask council for approve investment over a 10-year period of the 10 top priority areas. The biodiversity strategy was approved about a year ago, and it's about increasing the quality and quantity of natural habitat. It's about designing the built environment to support biodiversity, and also about increasing access to and awareness of nature in the city. And this, there was a biodiversity advisory group, and the OALA had a representative sitting on that group to provide advice to the city. Next slide. So investment is an incredibly important tool. So and I always find that things work well when you need the advocacy from people and awareness, but then you also need rules, because developers, people tend to meet the minimum requirement of a rule. But then you also need incentives. So you need the city or whoever to invest money in raising that bar. So you have the early adopters and the leaders can take advantage of that, and then can encourage them through providing them money to do better. So what we've set out as part of the Green Standard is that for buildings that achieve a set of performance measures, and there's a set of core performance measures and then a set of optional ones that they can choose from, that if that is certified or verified by a third party, then they can receive a refund on their development charges. And that refund can be quite substantive. It's capped per unit. However, it can turn into anywhere from $100,000 to $1 million, depending on the size of the development. So it really does work as a really good incentive and a way for developers to stretch the way they meet things. So things that are there are a higher performance for stormwater. So instead of retaining 5 millimeters from every storm event, they have to retain 10 millimeters. And that is extremely challenging, especially when you're building lot line to lot line. It requires a lot of creativity in thinking how you're going to do that. It requires a higher energy performance. It requires submission is an optional one. They could submit a resilience checklist, provide a refuge area in the building, and also 5% renewable energy, pieces like that. So we've had a really good turnout since the inception of the program. We've had 47 projects which have been certified to Tier 2 level and that have received a refund on their development charges that they've paid. So we now have, in version 3 of the Toronto Green Standard, we have 4 tiers of performance, so that the development community could see where we're going next in terms of energy performance. And the highest tier, which is tier 4, is essentially a near zero development, or a passive house, if you think of it that way, a development. And the reason is near zero was because it's still thinking of using electricity from hydro, which in Toronto's case, there's a small amount that's provided by natural gas, so that's why it's near zero and not quite net zero. And now, currently, we're starting to embark on version 4 of the Toronto Green Standard. We're in our background research phase, and we always engage a group of landscape architects in that conversation to give us feedback on how it's been working for them and what improvements perhaps we could make, and so we could move things to the next level in terms of either process or performance measure. Next slide. So the next slide is another way we incent things. So under the Green Roof bylaw, you can choose an option to pay cash in lieu instead of completing your requirement for the green roof, and that is set at $200 a square meter. And so we have a little fund set up which provides funding for the Eco Roof Incentive Program. And so far we've had over 516 projects over the past 10 years, including 91 green roofs and 425 cool roofs. And those are all on existing buildings, except for schools, where we do help them out by providing funding from that program for their new builds as well. Next slide. So another tool that we have, another investment we can make, is in green streets, and we had technical guidelines which were done again by Shoreline and Company, and they provide technical guidance on how to build green infrastructure into our streets and our public realm. It's an innovative approach that uses a decision model to select the right treatment based on the soil type and local conditions. It helps the designer determine the right approach. We are been looking at a number of pilot projects. You can see one, or part of one, that's actually been constructed there at Fieldstead Avenue in Coxwell in Toronto. We have other ones under development, such as Raindrop Plaza on the lower left there. And there's about 7 projects that have been completed in the right-of-way, and there's a bunch more planned for next year. And we're trying to link it up to where we have basement flooding identified in the city, and thinking about where we can incorporate green infrastructure interventions along these areas. Next slide. So Corktown Common, a new park in Toronto, and it's a good example of how landscape architects lead climate resilience design. Sorry, next slide, Julian. There we go. It allows for flooding from the Don River that you can see in the image there, and the way it's designed. And it also manages stormwater on the site. It's also about reconnecting to the native ecology of the area. There's a large marsh on site, and it supports plant communities native to the Don River, and reestablish the ecological heritage as a Crown Reserve. It's also, and as I mentioned, it's part of the park's ecological stormwater management system, receiving and treating runoff from the western side. And you can see a close-up there. I was in the park last week, actually, and enjoyed it very much. And all the native plants are blooming. The purple asters you can see out there. Next slide. Another important point, I'm sure you've been following this, it's quite exciting, is the Portland's flood protection, which is intended to establish and sustain the form and the features and functions of a natural river mouth, and provide critical flood protection to about 240 hectares of Toronto's eastern waterfront. And the work is being led by a team of landscape architects, led by the firm Michael von Valkenburg, but also by our local team of landscape architects working for Waterfront Toronto. Next slide. Also really important is communication. So we don't just always try and write rules. We try and think of ways to get the message out there in different ways. And we have a whole biodiversity series at the City of Toronto. There's about 9 booklets now. And a few years ago, probably about 5 years ago now, it actually won an OALA award for service to the environment. And they're really cool, actually. If you go to the biodiversity in Toronto, you can see the PDFs of them, or they can also be sent out to people. There's spiders, reptiles, bees, butterflies, trees and shrubs. So it's surprising the amount of biodiversity that actually exists in the city. Another piece we did is we hired a well-known landscape photographer, Robert Burley, to help us produce a book called An Enduring Wilderness. And again, it's really about the surprising amount of natural areas that we have in the City of Toronto. It makes a great coffee table book, and it's available at Spacing as well as online. But again, it's trying to get that message out there that we actually have this incredible resource in the city. Because the more people know about it and are aware of it, the more they can advocate to help support the protection of it. Next slide. So back to the beginning where we started with the challenge of the question, how can we make growth more resilient? And the workshop really challenged us to think about how we are achieving climate resilience. What are the opportunities, gaps, and next step? And then what role can planning play in making us more resilient to climate? And next slide. And the result of the workshop was 6 different principles that emerged as very important to the city planners attending it. So it was one that growth has to consider the human experience, that we have to think intergenerationally, that we have to make hard decisions now that will benefit future generations. 3, that we need to build a city able to withstand and thrive in the face of climate change. 4, we need to build nature into the city. 5, we need to take leadership on climate resilience by trying new things, by experimenting. We also need systems thinking. We ask how each project will make the city more resilient and how it's connected into the larger system. Next slide. So one of the immediate results of the workshop was the action that emerged in the resilience strategy that was directed to city planning, which is to integrate resilience into development and land use planning processes, to review all our policies and tools to identify where climate resilience can be further advanced, and then to initiate training for a committee of adjustment members on climate resilience, including stormwater management and the protection of natural heritage. And I'm happy to tell you we actually have done that. We did that a year ago. We went in and trained them on it, and it was really interesting. They really appreciated it, and it gave them a much better understanding of the importance of the natural area, especially when you have an adjustment or a variance to a home adjacent to a ravine area, considering what was important. Next slide. So now it's thinking about what, more specifically, I guess, what are the role of landscape architects. Next slide. So it's thinking about the capacity that currently exists when it comes to understanding and applying adaptation in practice. And we've got great examples from across the country about projects that landscape architects have designed or participated in. Landscape architects have long been the architects of nature. We're trained to understand the capacity of the land and the dynamic forces of nature, how rain, snow, wind, and sun interact with the soil, the topography, the vegetation, how they interact with the land. We understand the natural forces and how those natural forces will build on the framework we've designed. I went to a lecture a couple years ago by Thomas Wolfe, and one of the thoughts that resonated with me, I guess, that he stated was that time is a landscape architect's superpower. Designers have skills and tools to be powerful agents of change. Next slide. And of course, we have many examples of innovative design solutions. No, go back one. So the slide that we should be seeing is the innovative design solutions, the Portland's flood protection, Cottonwood's flats, infrastructure. Everybody thinks of the nice trees and they forget about the incredible design work that goes into thinking, the soil cells or technology or trenches or whatever that goes into ensuring those trees will be healthy. So through innovative design solutions for natural spaces that can absorb, detain, allow for movement of water, use trees, vegetation materials to reduce the ambient temperature, provide conditions that support biodiversity designed to protect sensitive landscapes, reduce erosion, protect shorelines along coasts, rivers, lakes, and reduce impacts of forest fires. And I really like this quote. It's not mine, it's the project director at Waterfront Toronto, is landscape architects bring a strong and holistic vision, the technical capacity to lead the complex process of city building, and the ability to guide decision-making throughout design and construction. Next slide. So this is about thinking about how do we move the yardstick further on the practical side of adaptation. And we've got a raised awareness, as we talked about previously, and certainly the International Federation of Landscape Architects have declared a climate and biodiversity emergency. The CSLA has signed on a joint statement to advance integrated climate actions with our other professions, including the planners, the architects, and the Canadian Water and Wastewater Association. And we've had climate strikes, the youth movement. We have a great organization within our city called Design for Climate Action. If you haven't checked them out, I encourage you to do so. It's young landscape architects and other designers allied to take action on climate. We're also, what's really important is to raise the bar, that we change the expectations. We do that in all the ways that I've talked to you about and that I've been thinking about, and also to drive the capacity. In my world, requiring sustainable performance measures such as the green standard at site plan and requiring green roofs for large sites has driven expertise, and it's driven consultants who've actually developed themselves and then can advertise themselves as we can solve this for you. We know how to do the Toronto Green Standards, so that's a good thing. And also investments such as the investment in the ravines, which is planned to be about $105 million over the next 10 years for the top 10 priority sites to invest in green streets. We also need more understanding. We have lots to do, obviously. We need to understand more about the performance of new technology, and we need to convince the engineer sometimes about the performance of that technology. Next slide. So it's what do we need to move the yardstick further on the practical side? And so some of it's knowledge, and the CSLA does have a great website. We have the Climate Change Adaptation Working Group, and we have the Municipal Roundtable. If you work for a municipality and you're interested to join the roundtable, please do. There's about 24, 25 members, anywhere from 10 to 20 participate at a monthly meeting and share their expertise with other municipal landscape architects. And also, to remind you, we have this wonderful resource on adaptation, the Adaptation Primers, and which was done by Colleen Mercer-Clark. Primer 1 talks about the current science on climate change, what it means for Canada. Primer 2 focuses on framing the policy and planning approaches to mitigation and adaptation with an emphasis on building resilience, designing for positive transformation, and ensuring sustainability in ecosystems and societies. The third primer focuses on an overview of the opportunities to create resilient communities that enhance public well-being and integrate nature. And primer 4 focuses on the options for response to rising waters, ranging from persisting in place to retreat and to migration. There's also, the other is the Climate Atlas tool is amazing. There's also resources on the ASLA website, and CSLA has their mission areas, and so all these resources can be found there. And that basically is the end of my presentation, but I'm very happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Jane. I appreciate you going through everything, and there have been a few questions that have come in. I'll remind anybody else that you may just type in your questions to the chat box that should be somewhere around the side. I can see a few more coming in. And so the first question, Jane, was that it mentions that the city has developed ponds in a ravine, I guess, near where this person lives. And not long after that, phragmites took over. And so he wondered if the city is doing anything about that challenge.
It certainly definitely has their attention. What the city does like to do is to educate people or train they like to know about where those locations are, and they do have a great team that supports going out to removing invasive species. They don't necessarily encourage people, even though landscape architects might know what they're doing. Most of the public don't, and they end up doing more damage than good if they just remove them on their own from public areas. So you can connect in. There's usually a number of landscape architects who work in the group. It's a group in forestry, and it's a natural environment group, and they run a great. But if you go to biodiversity, or if you go to invasive species in Toronto, you'll probably come up with the site.
Great, thanks, Jane. And they also noted that the city has planted an acer platanoid on their street, and they wondered if that is acceptable. That's an acceptable, I guess, treatment for.
I don't manage the street treating group, but that's, if it. I don't know the answer to that directly, because it's usually, if the city's planted it, it has to meet their approved requirements for street trees, and that's done by forestry. Not that forestry doesn't make errors. Recently in my local neighborhood, they planted a bunch of new trees at the bottom of a toboggan hill. So they were quickly replanted in a different location, because they didn't kind of appreciate the fact that the park had many different uses. So I would check in. The best way to check in, if you want, on your particular area, is to call 311, and they'll connect you with the right staff person in forestry who can answer your question.
Great, thanks, Jane. This next person actually has 3 questions, so I'll try to do them one at a time. Is there any consideration for water requirements for soft landscaping within a regulatory tool?
So the requirement, one at a time is good. So the performance measure for new construction, new development, is that they have to retain 5 millimeters from every storm event, which is about 50% of what falls on the city in a given year. So the soft landscaping, no, the zoning doesn't allow us to set a performance measure that way. It just says that so much of your site has to be soft landscaping. And it's interesting because we do not consider artificial turf to be soft landscaping. It's hard landscaping. And so there's been a number of submissions for variances to the soft landscaping to allow for artificial turf. So, always interesting.
Thanks. And are you able to speak to the length of life cycle on green roofs as it relates to replacement of waterproof membranes?
From earlier research that I read, I understand that it's 30 years. Normally a membrane might last 15 years, so it would double that life expectancy. I do know, if you're familiar with the green roof at Robson Square in Vancouver, I do know that after 30 years they went in to replace the membrane, but it was 30 years, so it did well. And then they took everything out, and then they replaced all the plants, supervised by Cornelia Oberlander, who had designed that green roof to begin with.
Good, thanks. And is there consideration for nitrous oxide, effluent from fertilizers, as a greenhouse gas, as it is on the order of 700 times more potent than carbon dioxide?
Great question that I don't know the answer to.
Thanks. That's and the next question, we're moving on to a different person saying, thank you, Jane, amazing progress. What were the most significant obstacles that you faced in getting this far, and how did you overcome them?
Do you know what's really challenging is a number of things. One, you want to push as far as you can, but you want it to be approved. And if you push too far, you'll get a negative reaction the other way. So it was finding that right tension. And two, it was so the advocate. That's why the advocacy is so important, so that the politicians who are ultimately making the decision in our case, so that they can understand that. And then two, I'm losing my train of thought here, but it's really, oh, I know, it's really unintended consequences. And so it's another thing you have to be extremely aware of. So when we were writing the Green Roof bylaw, we realized that one is an expensive thing, and so that's why we applied it to larger buildings. But then we also realized that we had this policy that really wanted to promote and encourage grade-related residential along avenues. But with the addition of the Green Roof bylaw, they weren't going to be able to afford it. So it would dissuade that kind of development. So we relaxed that requirement under the Green Roof bylaw for that type of development. We also relaxed, so it would have been an unintended consequence that we, discouraged that grade-related residential development. The other one that we adjusted was the idea of applying green roofs. When I first took on this portfolio, I was thinking, oh, great. You fly into Toronto, you see all these large flat roofs. Let's just think about them being green. Wouldn't that be fabulous? And then you realize that if there was a green roof bylaw requiring them all to have green roofs, industry would just go to Mississauga. So you would undermine that whole thing about having jobs and people living, so they wouldn't have to commute so far, and you would take away a valuable income from the city in terms of having that industry locate there. It's because it's difficult, and it's actually almost, it would end up being, 15 to 20% of the cost of the whole structure if you were to have a green roof on an industrial building. So that was challenging. In fact, what we did was we sort of took a pause on industry when we first introduced the Green Roof bylaw and said we'd come back with a refined, and we talked to them a lot about what we should do, and then came back with a revised version for them.
Great. And I think you've given one hint, but you may be able to help with even more ideas. We've got a question from somebody saying, how can a new graduate landscape architect become more engaged in climate resilience in the city?
There's a lot of ways, but I'd really recommend that one way is to join up with Design for Climate Action. They're doing a lot of thinking about this, so that would be a great group to connect in with. And in different ways, I guess you can always contact Ingrid about where volunteers are needed for various committees in the city. We don't have a committee on climate change at the OALA when we're just a bit too thin to offer that up. We do have at the national level. And if you look on the CSLA, there's a bunch of mission areas. You can look at that, and there'll be more ones moving forward, so you can look at that engagement. Any other thoughts, Ingrid?
No, I think that's great. I wonder too,
No.
Climate Action, do they have a website? I know they're pretty new, and I'm not sure if there's a website or what is the best.
There is, and we'll make sure, if it's not already, we'll make sure that it's up on ours so people can link to it. The other, there's a lot going on in the city. Transform TO, which is essentially our climate action plan, often has engagement, and so getting on that mailing list to be made aware of things that are coming up, and you could go and have a conversation as they're doing their consultation, which may be coming up again because they're currently working on modeling the entire city to see how we could what we need to do to get to net zero emissions by 2050 or sooner, because the mayor declared a climate emergency a year ago, as most municipalities did across Canada. And so that's a modeling exercise to figure out how we can get there. And net zero means conserving energy, and it means also, producing energy, but it also means, in my mind anyway, some thinking about carbon sequestration through the use of plant material.
Great, thanks. And the next one, it first thanks you for your sustained work on environment and sustainability in the city. And it asks, what have been some of the challenges you and your colleagues have faced in developing policies, standards, and strategies, and what do you wish would be improved or would be improved?
I guess it's always challenging, is with two challenges from my perspective. One, you always going to go further, faster, and it's a slow process, right? Because you have to think it through so carefully, and you have to get all the so it's a slow machine. Bureaucracy is a very slow machine, right? That as it moves through, and so you want to do it better sooner, and of course you'd like to have more resources to do that and be able to invest more to make the changes sooner. I had another thought as well. It's I know, my other pet peeve, I guess, is having people come up with what they think is a great idea from another, from California or somewhere else, and say, well, you should do this in Toronto, without any regard to, you have to really assess your place, your climate, whether it, anywhere in Ontario, whether it's Sarnia or Toronto. You have to think about what your community needs. What are the challenges? It has to be specific, and it has to emerge out of the problems that you're having in your city, not just, oh, this is a great idea, let's pick this and plunk it in here, because it has no meaning, because you want to be effective. And there's great sexy ideas out there that get a lot of political time or media time, but if they don't make a difference, they don't matter in my mind. You have to do things that matter. And so kind of sorting that out. So our challenge is always to stay ahead of the politicians, to stay ahead of others, so that we have answers by the time they get to thinking about that great idea from California or wherever it is.
That's great. Thank you, Jane. And thank you to Todd, who sent through the website. So I'll try and type that out, Todd. I'm not doing both at the same time, but it is designclimateaction, just all together.org, for anybody that's interested in learning more about that. The next question is asking if Toronto integrates subdivision stormwater into dedicated parkland blocks.
So that's another challenge, actually, we always face, is the kind of disconnect sometimes, because there's always concern with parkland that you don't want it compromised by other infrastructure. There have been opportunities where we do integrate that better, and we've been thinking more about doing it, because especially in Toronto, we have such an incredibly limited amount of space. So integrating both the construction of our streets, the construction of our parkland, with ways that we can do, light touches in terms of infiltration and stronger touches in terms of bioswales, but and also tanks. And there's been certainly some basement flooding mitigation measures have involved putting a tank under a park. It's kind of the ends. It's not the top solution. You always want infiltration first, but sometimes that's not going to work, so you want to go there. So to answer your question, I believe there is cases. If not, there are emerging cases where we're looking at doing that.
Great. Thank you, Jane. And I'll say that we've got 5 minutes left. I've got 2 more questions that are here now, because we will try to end at 1 o'clock, just to be respectful of everybody else's time, and yours as well, Jane. The next question is, the city likes to see permeable paving. However, has the city taken into consideration that the pores that are filled initially with aggregate get filled over time with sediment, and the paving no longer functions as intended? And with that, he asks, has the city discussed regular and required maintenance to ensure that these surfaces continue to function, setting measures in place?
That's often been an issue when you are employing permeable paving, or suggesting that, or somebody actually puts it into play, because it is requiring maintenance. A lot of our, aside from our own property, which of course we can maintain and develop a cycle of maintenance, for the private developer, we don't have much clout. So we have maintenance requirements for sort of 2 years beyond a construction, often in the form of a letter of credit, which is about the planting material. And for the green roof bylaw, we have maintenance for 2 years. So we don't have much clout past approval of site plan, to be honest with you. So it's an issue. Not everything has perfect answers, and we just have to keep thinking of ways to make sure that happens.
That's where the volunteer groups of new landscape architects can come in. And the last question is potentially for future landscape architects that may be out there. First, we thank you for your advocacy and making Toronto such an environmental leader. And then note that this person's kids are studying lost rivers in Toronto and wonders if there's any work being done by the city on any of these.
Yes, there is actually, but it's actually being done by the Conservation Authority, and we're working with them on lost rivers, where they are, and thinking about what we might do with that information. But there's somebody at the Conservation Authority actually had a graduate student working with them on looking at the lost rivers in Toronto and thinking about them, and we've been engaged in a number of presentations, and that's always emerging work. We've thought about it before, and now we're rethinking about it again. Part of the growth plan had asked everybody to map all the water resources and aquifers. So we're thinking about does that include lost rivers? So early days of thinking, but we're definitely aware and engaged in that.
Great, thanks. If they wanted, if they were doing these, would it more be the TRCA that they would contact that might have something on it? Okay.
Yeah, definitely the TRCA.
Okay, great. Well, Jane, it brings us to 12:59, and that completes the questions. So on behalf of the Continuing Education Committee, we won't make Jim come back on, even though he's in the background. Thank you for taking the time, and others wouldn't know it, but Jane's internet also went out. So thank you for working around to find other technical ways to be able to present to everybody today. And to all the members, as a note that we will email out the recording of today. That'll come out in about an hour or so. So anybody that registered for it will get that as well. And then it'll be on our website in the members area as well. Thank you again to Jean. Thank you to Jim for the background work as well. And just a quick final thank you to Julene, our coordinator, who has made sure that everything runs as smoothly as possible today. Thanks very much.
Yes, and thanks for advancing my slides. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.